Okay, so it looks like everybody is in now. Great, so I will share my screen and bring up our presentation. 1 second. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being patient with us as we get through technical difficulties, which has happened every single day that I've worked remotely. So not surprising that it happens today. So appreciate you all being patient. My name is Aisha Chaudhry. I don't use any pronouns, just my name. I'm the Reproductive Justice Manager at EverThrive, Illinois. And we're here to talk, I'm here to talk to you about contraceptive justice, and I'll let Anne introduce herself.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Hendrickson. I am the Director of Pop Dev, which is a temporary program of CLIP, one of the co-sponsors of this conference. And I'm really glad to be here with you today. Thanks.
I'm going to turn my video off because I know that that helps with my connection. I just wanted to also start with a little understanding of who's in the room. So wanted to share, oh, sorry, also I realized I didn't really properly introduce myself. As the Reproductive Justice Manager at EverThrive, Illinois, I've been leading the Contraceptive Justice Project and for the past couple years, and we created this report and framework to really talk about what it means to increase access using the reproductive justice framework for contraception. I've been doing RJ work for 13 years, and I started in domestic violence advocacy and also sexual health education. And I'm the co-chair of the board of directors at Illinois Caucus for Adolescent Health, ICA. So really excited to see you all today. So Zoom has an annotate feature, which is kind of cute and allows us to have a little bit of interaction before we go into our presentation. So if you scroll up to the top of your screen till where the toolbar kind of comes down, you'll see a button called Annotate with like a little pen feature. So if you click that, you'll see a couple of different options. Stamp is the one that feels easiest to me sometimes. And so you can select what image you want to use and then click what category represents who you are. So organizer, activist, educator, researcher, student, or advocate. And just go ahead and put whatever little stamp you want under that so we can kind of get a sense of. You can also write if there's an option to include text if one of these categories does not match you. So please feel free to just go ahead and add that. We'll spend a minute doing this. Okay, it looks like the annotations are slowing down a little bit. So maybe everybody's gotten a chance to go. So it seems like a lot of folks, okay, we still have some coming up. A lot of folks are mostly educators and advocates, which is exciting. Let's see, there's something in the chat. All right, folks are also writing in the chat, educator and advocate, great. Yeah, if annotation is not working for you, please just go ahead and put it in the chat as well. And I'm going to update the annotation chart with what people are saying. So we have 3 more advocates and 2 educators. Okay. I know that some folks just got added into the room right now. So again, annotations, if you scroll up to the top of the screen, a little drop box will come down and you'll see a pen, annotate button, and stamp. If you click that, then stamp is usually the easiest one to go with. Thank you all. Okay, we have a lot of advocates. Awesome. We're gonna go ahead and move to the next question that we had. So we're gonna clear this. Oh no, people are still going. Clear. And then we're gonna go to this, oh, sorry. This next question that we have, which we wanted to hear, how well informed are you about reproductive justice? So just go ahead and if this is a spectrum here on the left, very well informed, to not informed or not aware of reproductive justice. Maybe you actually just heard the term but have no idea what it means. So go ahead and put on the spectrum where you fall. Looks like there's a lot of folks who know at least a little bit about RJ, feel like in the middle. We have a good representation of folks who feel well informed. I love that. We'll spend another minute here for folks to plot themselves on the spectrum. Okay, cool. Looks like it's slowing down a little bit. So the next question I wanted to ask, let me clear these first. The next question I wanted to ask is, how well informed are people around contraception issues? So like specifically what we're talking about today, safety, contraceptive safety. So how well informed are you around like new methods of contraception and their safety issues or not? Okay, this looks kind of similar, but maybe a little bit less information around contraceptive safety. Cool. Slowed down a little bit, so I'm feeling like folks got to answer. So, and I wanted to see if Anne had a specific question that you wanted to ask on this spectrum as well.
Thanks. It's really fun to watch all of these populate the field. If I could ask how familiar people are with Depo-Provera specifically.
Big check mark. Love that. Okay, it looks like folks are mostly aware or feel like in the middle or well aware.
It's exciting to see. I hope we can have a real conversations even with the limits of how we can communicate. I'm glad you're here.
Same, thank you all. So I'm gonna clear this and we'll start with our presentation. So a little bit about the contraceptive justice framework, which I've named a little earlier. And it's also there's a little bit of, there's some PDFs that we uploaded as well related to our session today. So go ahead and you can download those PDFs, but also follow along here. So contraceptive justice is a framework that we created here in Illinois with a coalition of folks who represent reproductive health care providers, reproductive rights advocates, reproductive justice organizations, and other community-based organizations who work with folks who have barriers to contraceptive care. So we worked on creating a framework that addressed all the barriers that people were facing beyond just paying for it, which we also know is a big barrier, right? But we wanted to think a little bit broader because a lot of times when laws get passed around access, it doesn't actually reach the most marginalized people. It ends up increasing access for people who already had some access. And so in order to really think about how do we reach the people who never get reached, how do we make sure that they have a high quality experience when wanting to receive contraceptive care or sexual reproductive health care. And so the definition that we came up with together in this coalition after spending some time doing research and a landscape assessment was this framework, basically. So all people having the social, political, and economic power, rights, access, and resources to receive contraceptive and pregnancy prevention care that is person-centered, confidential, comprehensive, medically accurate, developmentally appropriate, LGBTQIA+ affirming, accessible, both physically and financially, trauma responsive, culturally and linguistically affirming, harm reduction grounded, pro-choice, sex and body positive, and challenging of explicit and implicit bias, shame, and stigma. Knowing that if we are able to achieve each of these dimensions in our contraceptive access work, in our program, in our materials, in our trainings, that then we are able to work towards contraceptive justice for all. So part of this is also recognizing that a lot of the things that people need right now to even get this are to even work towards contraceptive justice are just unfortunately extremely limited due to information barriers, right? And also understanding our laws and understanding what people have the right to. And also the fact that like health insurance is tied to our employment so much of the time, and that really limits how we can access the care that we want. And then the ACA has been having some, we've been hearing some conversations around the ACA, and the ACA was really the first place that made contraception covered without cost sharing as part of preventative care. And so that is the bare minimum that we think that we need to have to keep moving forward. Also wanted to share that while we're presenting, Anne and I do want us to be interactive as much as possible. So sometimes it's hard for me to see if there's things in the chat or if somebody has a question. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just share the question or put it in the chat. And our Zoom host will maybe help us monitor the chat box, but just wanted to lay that out here. So if, since now folks know how to annotate, I wanted to ask if there's any parts of this framework that you like or don't like or confused by or want to talk more about, you can either annotate on the screen or share or ask a question in the chat box if there's anything before I move on, because I know that this is hefty. All right. we'll keep moving forward. There's a little couple dots here, let me clear them. The reason that we also wanted to talk about what acceptability looks like, not just what accessibility and awareness looks like, is because we need all of these components when we're talking about contraception access and sexual and reproductive health care. So what we mean by accessibility is like the overall ability to attain contraception physically and financially. There are a lot more components in accessibility, including language that like impact how we can access these things as well. So really considering that's what we mean when people talk about a contraceptive access project. They want to increase people's ability to obtain contraception, right? When we talk about an awareness campaign or awareness project, it's around the overall knowledge of contraception, the different methods and instructions for use. So sex ed is an awareness strategy, really, right, to talk about contraception. And then also public awareness campaigns, social media campaigns also. Acceptability is the overall ability and willingness of the patient to use the medicine as intended. So this is like a like a medical term, right? So the overall ability and willingness of a person to use contraception as it's intended. And so this has a large impact on people because if you don't like your method, you're probably not going to use it consistently or well, right? And that if the method is difficult to use to begin with, you also might not want to use it, right? So acceptability has a really big place in contraceptive medicine as compared to like other forms of healthcare, because how it impacts your daily life, your sex life, your mental health, your physical body, and all the other components of your life that make up your day-to-day. If it's not acceptable to you, it doesn't matter if you were able to get it. It doesn't matter if you know what it is, right? And that this part actually kind of is minimized, unfortunately, in contraception, because side effects are a huge part of acceptability, and a lot of times folks are just told to deal with them instead of really getting to the root of that. Acceptability also has to do with like what people have heard about the method and if there's been harm that's caused by the method, and how different governments and institutions and systems use the method on people or recommend or target people with the method. That affects the acceptability as well. So all of this is impacted by safety. All of this influences and impacts a person's contraceptive desires and intention, right? So what types of contraception we want to use, what we want contraception to do for ourselves, right? Because pregnancy prevention is not the only reason that people use contraception. STI prevention, health reasons as well, to manage medical issues and menstruation. We also know that all of this impacts people's correct and consistent use of contraception. So folks who have contraception that's of a higher acceptability, they prefer it more, they like it more, it's easier to use for them, they're obviously going to be able to use it more consistently and correctly and be able to get the highest benefit from it. Unfortunately, contraceptive access projects have centered on increasing financial access and measuring success by uptake. That does not follow a contraceptive justice framework or a reproductive justice framework at all, right? Because if we're just centered on increasing people's financial access, if we just think that finance is the only barrier that people have, and that once we remove that barrier, people should obviously want it and should take it, which is why like the success is measured just by the uptake. How many people got this method? Specifically, we see this around LARC, long-acting reversible contraceptives. Like by showing how many people have LARC, people assume that that's like a measure of success. And that is not actually a measure of success in contraceptive care for the way that we want to define it, because the measure of success is defined by the person using the contraception. They get to define how successful that method is for them. They get to define if that is acceptable to them to use, right? And that is the flip that we want to do. because the problems with it, with increasing financial access to specific methods, but not doing a good job of making those methods safer, or making those or giving people autonomy to choose whatever method, right? If only certain methods are free, but not every method is free. These financial barriers and incentives skew autonomy, right? Because it makes it the playing field not level. Acceptability is assumed, like that people will just deal with these methods of all the side effects of the methods of contraception, that like people obviously have a willingness and desire to use it. So it's just assumed, and therefore it's deprioritized when we talk about contraception. And measuring success by uptake of contraception leads to coercive tactics, right? Because if somebody doesn't want to use contraception, that's not a failure. That's still success, because they figured out that they didn't want to use contraception. That is still a contraceptive intention, and that is still, success from the reproductive justice framework. So we really, our conversation today is talking about how we have to talk about safety if we want to talk about access, and if we want to talk about justice, because it is a huge barrier for a lot of people. Vicarious experience, which is what we share and talk about with other people, about our own experiences around contraception, and the storytelling that we have, right? That's how we learn about it. And if we're not taking that into account, and we're just telling people, don't trust other people's stories, don't trust other people's side effects, just you should try it yourself, like they're not acknowledging the way that we learn and share information in our communities, and how we talk about safety and acceptability in our spaces. Sister Song and National Women's Health Network created a long-acting reversible contraception statement of principles, or a LARC statement of principles, to really talk about how I had, briefly mentioned how LARC methods, there's been a lot of increase of financial access to LARC methods, and promoting LARC as best, or a LARC first model, because of just the efficacy rate of pregnancy prevention. So the assumption that because there's a very little margin of error, because once you insert the device, you can't really use it improperly, right? That it has a higher efficacy than other methods of contraception. So there's been a lot of programs to promote it as best. This statement of principles was published in 2016 in response to all of that enthusiasm, and in response to the financial incentives different states were providing for people to get IUDs and implants. The government funded federal programs, and also the fact that removals were not included. So you can get a LARC inserted by a lot of these programs, but you couldn't get it removed. In certain states, you still can't get if you have Medicaid, you still can't get a LARC method removed unless it's a medical necessity. They won't cover it otherwise. And the reason why, again, I talked about it's highly effective by the way that they define it for pregnancy prevention purposes specifically. It's long acting, so you don't have to think about it for a really long time, both for the provider and the person using it. And it's provider controlled, which I think also, benefits and serves the healthcare industry, because they feel like a patient or a person won't mess up using this method. It's controlled by them, they insert it, and then they get to remove it when it's time to get removed. And so there's a lot of folks assume sometimes that provider controlled methods might be better. Some of the problems that people don't consider around LARC is that there is insertion pain and trauma for some folks. So the LARC first preface really does not account for the fact that LARCs are not for everybody. They, just because they're highly effective at preventing pregnancy, does not mean that they're great for everyone, including acceptability of them, right? So these are the only devices that have to be inserted by a doctor. Other devices, other contraceptive methods don't. There could be infection or expulsion or perforation. So the risks around this exist too, but they've been sometimes minimized in order to continue talking about how LARC is best. And also there's still negative mental health and libido side effects and no skin benefits compared to other methods of contraception. So again, when we move away from pregnancy prevention, we see why LARC is not best for everyone, and why programs that promote LARC or put LARC at the top of their chart or talk about them first or recommend them first are problematic because of this. Some reproductive injustice issues that we talk about when it comes to contraception. There's a history of contraception being tested on people who did not have the power to say no or consent, being able to say, like, not consent to these studies. And so Enovid, which was the very first contraceptive pill in the United States, was first tested in Puerto Rico, which is a current colony of the United States. So, you know, we're not even in a post-colonial world, we're in a current colonial world. So this was first tested in Puerto Rico with hormone levels 20 times higher than what is considered safe now, right? So in order for the United States to get a safe birth control pill, we put thousands of people through unsafe usage of these methods. Before FDA approval, Depo was used on Native people without consent to stop menstruation and people with disabilities. Again, so this was used by Indian Health Services, so our own healthcare system here in the United States for Native American and Indigenous people. Norplant, which was one of the first implants, like the rod that goes into your arm, was targeted towards low-income people of color and was financially incentivized, meaning that if you get the Norplant, you could get a financial incentive. And I mentioned earlier that Medicaid in some states won't cover LARC removal for any other reason besides medical necessity, and your desire for pregnancy doesn't count as a reason for wanting to get the LARC removed. Fortunately, this is not the case in Illinois, which is where I'm in Chicago, Illinois. But the fact that this still exists in certain states today is disturbing and completely unethical. Thinking about how these contraceptive frameworks that really push access through removing financial barriers and incentives, it comes from a long legacy of imperialism and colonialism. Genocide is defined as killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. This is from the United Nations. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. These are all descriptions of types of genocide. So we are definitely dealing with imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Population control is a reason why contraception flourished under public health in the United States for so long, and also why it was tested on people in Puerto Rico. This goes along with eugenics, which is the science of race betterment through breeding, right? And eugenics is a form of genocide because you are breeding out a specific group that exists by only encouraging certain people to have large families or to have families and preventing the birth of other families. In the United States, we had eugenical sterilization laws where the state had the right to forcibly sterilize people against their will because of different identities that they had, because they had a disability, because they were dependent upon the state, because they were of a certain age, because they had committed a crime. So these things existed in 32 states, lasting until 1982, when was the last forced eugenical sterilization law was removed. And population control to public health has, this framework still targets and incentivizes specific communities for the public health campaigns. And it's just using different language now. And that's also the concern around reproductive justice, is that a lot of organizations and groups are using the language of reproductive justice, but not actually following through on what that actually means. Genocide is a human rights issue and reproductive justice is a human rights framework. So RJ names, right, the three main tenets of, the three main tenets of RJ are that all people have the right to decide if and when and how many children they will have, as well as under what conditions they will give birth, decide if and when and how they will become pregnant, and whether or not they will carry to term, and parent the children they already have with the necessary social supports and safe environments and healthy communities without fear of violence from institutions or individuals. In the research that I did, we learned that some facilitators to contraceptive access included open and non-judgmental communication in the patient-provider relationship, comprehensive sex ed with medically accurate sex-positive information, and consensual parental or familial involvement, right? So not forced. these were actually bigger facilitators than just being able to increase financial access to contraception. And the biggest barriers to contraception were, first of all, side effects for people not wanting to use contraception because of the side effects, right? And that's an acceptability issue. Poor communication and coercion in the patient-provider relationship, scheduling and time constraints, both for the provider and the patient, access to good information, both in the clinical visit, but also outside of it. And then forced or fear of parental familial involvement. So when there is fear of it being happening against your will, then you are much less likely to go seek healthcare then. Part of this research also included some focus groups that we did, and participants shared that providers emphasize pregnancy prevention over their comfort and wellness, that providers deprioritize impact of side effects and were dismissive of those side effects, that some folks were unaware of the depot shot reducing bone density until it became a medical issue for them. Folks had continuous bleeding for 2 years with Nexplanon, but one person named that they were homeless at that time and uninsured and couldn't get it removed. And they, quote, thought about cutting it out themselves because they didn't want it to begin with. One person had to fight to get an IUD removed. And there are many people who wanted to switch due to side effects, but were told to stick it out. So they stopped using that method and stopped going to that provider. So there's a lot of research that shows exactly how these things are, the acceptability of contraception, the safety of contraception, are bigger factors than just physical and financial access when we're talking about it. And that's why we wanted to go a little bit deeper into talking about a specific method that Anne has been doing a lot of research around. So I'm going to pass it off to you, Anne. And I can forward the slides for you.
Great. Thank you. I'm already all riled up. I'm going to continue the conversation that Aisha started, talking about Depo-Provera and wrapping around Depo-Provera. I want to start with a little background on Depo, even though it sounds like people are pretty well versed on what Depo is, talk about its history of abuse and likewise the history of resistance to it. And from there, I want to give an update on some of the latest evidence on the Depo HIV link. And finally, I want to talk about the ways that Depo is being promoted, and perhaps you can add to this. I'd love that. But I'm also interested in the US and also the mass distribution that's taking place in international family planning. And I'm really excited to talk about what a reproductive justice response to Depo looks like today. So what is Depo-Provera? Here we have Depo is a synthetic hormone that suppresses ovulation for 3 months at a time. It's made exclusively by the US pharmaceutical Pfizer, which is much in the news for its COVID vaccine. There are 2 formulations of the drug, and you can see them on the screen. There's the shot on the left that is injected into the butt or shoulder muscles, and the other is the lower dosage formulation that is injected just under the skin and with the self-injection technology that's pictured on the right. Depo is associated with serious health effects. Aisha, can you? Thank you. Here's the list of the most common ones, and I just copied out of the Pfizer prescribing information. The first is menstrual irregularities. Bleeding, constant or no period at all, is one of the top reasons that people stop taking Depo. Other adverse effects, as you can see, include abdominal pain, weight gain, tiredness, dizziness, headache, nervousness, and decreased sex drive. Depo labeling also contains a series of warnings about other serious health effects. Next slide, please. And these include, and this is an FDA black box, and the black box is given to highlight potentially life-threatening adverse effects. And this one is about bone loss, which Aisha mentioned. And it's particularly serious for young people who are still growing. But a recent study from last summer suggests a doubling of bone loss for people who are also taking antiretroviral treatment containing tenofovir disoproxil fumarate, so TDF. Bone loss is one of several serious warnings, including risk of breast cancer, increased risk of breast cancer, blood clots, and serious depression, just to name a few. And there is a longer delay in return to fertility with Depo than most other hormonal methods. And like other hormonal methods, Depo doesn't provide any protection against sexually transmitted infections, and it has been linked with a heightened biological risk for HIV acquisition. And I want to talk about that at length with you in a minute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Depo abuse and resistance. Next slide, please. Feminist reproductive health activists have long challenged Depo as a dangerous contraception. There are a powerful legacy of resistance from groups like the Black Women Health Project, the Native American Women's Health Education Resource Center, the National Latina Health Organization, Insight, and the Committee on Women, Population, and the Environment, just to name a few. And there's also international resistance from groups like the UBINIG in Policy Research for Development Alternatives in Bangladesh, and FINRAGE, which is Feminist International Network of Resistance to Reproductive and Genetic Engineering. This was 20 years ago, but was still with the endless feminist acronyms. But I want to mention this history because I'm drawing on this resistance in my comments today. And I also want to recognize it because it provides as a path that provides ways forward for thinking about contraceptive safety and justice. So Depo's serious history of health effects make its abuse and coercion more shocking, right? Since the 1970s, Depo has been abused as a tool of population control in the US and internationally, and tested on and targeted at Black, Indigenous, people of color without full and informed consent. And I want to mention just a few examples here, and this is obviously a much more complicated story. The US-based Upjohn Company, which was bought out by Pfizer, received approval for Depo from the FDA in 1992. But in the 30 years before it was approved as a contraceptive, private physicians, university hospitals, family planning clinics, and mental health facilities regularly administered it throughout the US. And I should mention some examples. I'd also like to mention that from 1972 to 1978, the Grady Memorial Hospital injected in Atlanta, Georgia, injected approximately 9,000 African-American women with Depo. Many of the trial participants were not told of potential adverse effects. Some were not aware that this method was experimental, and some were coerced into participating. And I should mention the US Federal Indian Health Services prescribing Depo to at least 200 people, and that it was used in mental health facilities where informed consent or consent at all is questionable. FDA regulations meant that Upjohn couldn't produce Depo and disseminate it from the US. So as a workaround, they manufactured it in Belgium and sold it to International Planned Parenthood Federation and UNFPA, which is the United Nations Fund for Population. And these groups and their affiliates injected over 1 million women by 1978. It was considered the perfect tool for population control for poor women of color in the global South because it was provider controlled, long acting, and could be administered outside of a healthcare setting. It was also a mass experiment with very little follow-up in most cases, support or supervision. In South Africa, the apartheid government administered Depo as a tool for controlling Black fertility. Black women were forced to take Depo in order to keep their jobs in white-owned factories, for instance. So in 1992, after the FDA approved Depo, it was targeted at poor young women of color. As lawyer and activist Judy Scully observes, young Black women in Charleston and Chicago reported that they were pressured by medical providers to use either Norplant or Depo immediately after giving birth and immediately following abortion. She notes that this is when people are at their perhaps most vulnerable and unlikely to make clear decisions. DEPO is now entrenched as the method in many Black and Brown communities around the world, and this method familiarity is reinforced by targeted promotion and limited options. DEPO is the most commonly used method in sub-Saharan Africa, and the USAID, the US Agency for International Development, and UNFPA Supplies Coalition ship the vast majority of DEPO that they subsidize to sub-Saharan Africa. This continued DEPO promotion is especially significant given that worldwide high HIV prevalence rates correlates with high usage of injectable hormonal contraceptives. And this leads me to talk about, let me just check the chat here. Okay. This leads me to want to talk about DEPO and increased rates of HIV acquisition. Thanks for the slide. There are several decades of observational studies dating back to the FDA approval, that show an increased biological risk of HIV acquisition among DEPO users, particularly those at high risk for acquisition, like sex workers. The recent ECHO trial was a human randomized trial designed to settle the question once and for all of whether DEPO increased HIV risk. It started in 2015 and enrolled 7,800 voluntary participants from 12 research sites in Kenya, South Africa, Swaziland, and Zambia, who were randomly assigned to DEPO, JDEL, and the copper IUD. And this slide shows a clip from the ECHO website and the groups that are affiliated with the trial and who collaborated on it. The trial was challenged on methodological, ethical, and policy grounds. For instance, the ethics of randomly assigning trial participants to the DEPO arm were questionable, given the compelling evidence at the time that they might be at higher risk of HIV. And the condom distribution and HIV education that the trial did was not sufficient to counter that risk. Further, condom use by participants could skew the results of the trial. The trial results were announced in summer 2019, and based on them, the World Health Organization announced there was no link between DEPO and HIV and immediately changed its guidelines for use. But many researchers, epidemiologists, public health experts, and advocates now warn that this announcement is misleading and in fact dangerous. Next slide, please. And this is a PopDev Different Takes, which is my program's issue paper series by public health physician, epidemiologist, scholar, and activist Satya Mala. She analyzes the outcome of the trial and the World Health Organization guidelines that are based on the trial. And she argues that the design of the study made it impossible to find a statistically significant risk. And in fact, the results did show a risk. It was between 23 and 29% increased risk of getting HIV with DEPO. Among other concerns that she raises about the trial is that approximately 4% of participants contracted HIV while participating, and this is over 300 people. Far from showing no link, the trial produced concerning results. And as in a February 2020 commentary in the Lancet, public health experts stated the continued uncertainty as to whether Depo-Provera increases HIV risk must be conveyed to women. Next slide, please. In a powerful letter to the WHO from reproductive justice and AIDS organizers, health care providers, and other leaders, the signatories of an open letter to World Health Organization from Africa raise these points and more. And here I want to quote, because I think what they say is important and powerful. Quote, "As you know, the continued inability of public health systems in African countries and the global development agenda supporting them to provide a wide range of contraceptive methods in the 21st century means Depo-Provera remains the most widely distributed, administered, and thus used in Africa. Hence, 87 to 88% of the attributable HIV infections that would occur, with even a 20% increased risk, would occur in our communities in Southern and Eastern Africa. It seems clear to us that for African women and girls, it has been decided that a pregnancy is worse than an HIV infection. Next slide, please. With what is known and unknown about Depo and HIV, it is unconscionable to promote Depo over other options, yet that is the case. If anything, there's an increased mass promotion of Depo, both as the Sayana Press and as the shot. And pictured here is a promotion for the Sayana Press, which is the brand name for the lower dosage formulation of Depo. It's administered just under the skin with that single-use device pictured there called Uniject. The US-based medical development nonprofit PATH promotes the Sayana Press as power in her hands. Because it is self-injected, it is considered the optimal tool for what they call reproductive empowerment. Here you can see the page from their Power in Her Hands web presentation that describes Sayana Press as simple, elegant, empowering, revolutionary. These are words you might expect from a luxury car ad rather than a contested contraceptive method. The potential for HIV with the Sayana Press seems to be the same as with the shot. So the Sayana Press has been reported that Sudanese refugees in refugee camps in Uganda report being unable to access contraceptive services of any sort unless they enrolled in PATH's Uganda Sayana Press pilot study. This instance of reproductive coercion, because they had no other options rather than to enroll in the study, is part of a much or big effort at distribution. There's a subcutaneous DMPA access collaborative with PATH and John Snow, and they've led the dissemination of Sayana Press in up to 12 African countries. Nearly 500,000 doses were administered in the first 2 years alone, and this was happening simultaneously before to the ECHO trial before any results were produced. So this mass distribution when at the same time that there is, sorry, I've been found by a 3-year-old. Excuse me. I have a quarantine 3-year-old who's just discovered where I am, so this might get rocky. These efforts at Depo dissemination are tied with meeting numeric targets. They emphasize fertility control over the risk of HIV acquisition and other health concerns, and particularly in the case of the Sayana Press, which is intended for distribution outside health systems, right, power in her hands. The emphasis on low-acting reversible contraception has the potential to further erode weak health systems as funding is funneled into this technical fix. But that's not all. Depo, the shot, was was administered to ICE detainees in the Irwin County Detention Center who were given the shot without informed consent by the same doctor who conducted the forced sterilizations. One woman after the operation and the shot of Depo-Provera was still unclear exactly what happened to her body. Another went to the doctor for pain she was having related to a cyst removal operation, and she was given shots supposedly for the pain, but she learned later from a nurse that it was Depo. AP News reports that Depo may have been used without consent in detention camps in China on Muslim minority groups, where the majority of detainees are being held for already having too many children. Next slide, please. Thanks. I call for us to upend this claim that Depo is reproductive empowerment and expose the unequal power relations in its testing and promotion. For instance, the Gates Foundation is the main funder of the ECHO trials has shares in Pfizer, Depo's maker. In 2014, the Gates Foundation signed an agreement with Pfizer to subsidize the Cianna press and to make it cheaper and increase its sales. It's a conflict of interest for the most powerful global health funder, the largest private donor to the WHO, to fund both testing and simultaneous promotion of any method, particularly if it stands to gain financially. This needs to be monitored and exposed. I call to challenge the safety of Depo in relation to HIV as a reproductive justice imperative. The promotion of the ECHO trials for many important and strong sexual and reproductive health and AIDS groups in the US is troubling, given the robust scientific debate about the existing evidence. I call on us to take on the continued promotion of the shot and the Cianna press over other options, both in international family planning and in the US, too often to Black, Indigenous people of color. The abusive use of Depo on people who have not consented or have limited means to consent, like detainees, must be stopped. If we don't take on issues of contraceptive safety, we risk ceding the ground to anti-contraception, anti-choice activists. A collection of anti-abortion groups, including Human Life Alliance, Coalition on Abortion, Breast Cancer, and the Population Research Institute, have filed a citizens petition to the FDA calling for Depo to be taken off the market because of the Depo HIV risk. We can't let these groups define the terms of contraceptive safety and access. So I'll end there, and I look forward to questions, comments, and having your thoughts. Thank you very much.
So I stopped sharing the screen so we can kind of like be in a meeting space together. And folks, if we wanted to just leave time also for questions, you don't have to turn your camera on or anything, but if you wanted to either type in the chat or unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be wonderful.
Hi, my name is Mallory. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you both so much for this presentation. I had put my little star like, yeah, I know about Depo, and I didn't know shit. So thank you. I have a question about, well, I have a lot of questions, but I think about whether or how you've engaged or thought about engaging physician groups. I pulled up ACOG's Depo clinical guidance while you were talking about this, and it's just not honest. I don't know. It's problematic, and so I'm curious about that direction of advocacy. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Sure, I can start. There, you know, like there's a lot of conversations around advocacy around this and with healthcare providers and healthcare systems. I think what Anne mentioned about how there's anti-choice folks who want to use like the concerns around safety to then deny access, you know, becomes difficult. So providers sometimes in healthcare systems want to shy away from uplifting some of that data that talk about the higher risks, right? And so they don't want to cause panic in people because so they shy away from talking about those things. But you know, like the point is, the contraception is a tool. It's imperfect, but it's a tool. It's not right or wrong, and so people should know all the information to then decide what risks they're willing to take, right? Because we mitigate risks all day in our lives. We just don't want other people to decide what risks that we take, and that's the goal. But I do feel like people get concerned that if we start opening this door to talk about these things, even I feel this way about the reproductive like the history of reproductive injustices, right? People like, if we keep talking about that, people won't trust the healthcare system and move on. And I was like, well, we have to talk about this because you all haven't done enough work for us to trust you, right? And the fact that we remember this is not us making a big deal about it, it's you denying that it actually happened, right? Like when folks say like, you know, like I didn't do anything, my ancestors did this, when we're talking about slavery and white supremacy, right? So get over it and move on. It's like, we literally can't move on because not only has this not been healed and addressed, it's continuing to happen today, like ICE detention, right? Like what Anne just said, it's continuing to happen today. And the best way to increase access to contraception is to not deny the fact that people have used it for harm. And how do we then prevent that? Like, we actually have to work on preventing it, but people are sometimes afraid of opening that box. So we want to like rile up the folks in this space who have that activism part. And I do a lot of presentations to med students and public health students, I think, because that's how we also change the next generation of providers in the system. I'll pass it to you, Anne.
I am not a good person to talk to physicians. I don't have the background, and I do more on the research and advocacy side. So I feel like your answer is probably more to the point than mine would be. I do see a question in the chat. Thank you, Tulani, talking about how to share this information to our communities. I'm happy to share some PopDev resources of people who've written about DEPO and HIV, written about contraceptive safety that are free and downloadable, and on our website. I'm not sure the best way to do that, actually, if I should do it on the conference platform or if I should do it here. So if you have a preference, do let me know. And the publications that are PopDev publications are meant for all kinds of audiences, so they're not they're meant to be shared more broadly.
Hi, my name is Valerie, she, her pronouns. I kind of am harping off of what Mallory said. Like, I thought that I knew quite a bit, but clearly I don't know enough. So in your opinion, just based off the history behind DEPO, is there a way to ethically conduct DEPO research?
Good question. I think that one of the top questions I have is, why are we so invested in DEPO, or are we, right? In terms of that method, if it shows real risk, are there other methods that could be used that we know are less risky in terms of an HIV link? I think that there are enough concerning adverse effects that I do wonder about this push to really get the Sayana Press out. The Sayana Press was really developed alongside Depo-Provera in terms of the timing, and it was pre-population control. It was developed during the heyday of population control, I should say. So there's a lot about the legacy of where this method is coming from that makes me question why it's important to prove its safety in the first place. But not to sidestep your question, but those are things I think about, is why is this method so important to international family planning when there are others available. At the same time, I do think that DEPO is appropriate for some people, given all the variables that can make it a method that you might want to take. But I wonder at the millions and millions of dollars that have been invested in DEPO to this point to prove that it is a safe method. What do you think, Aisha?
Yeah, I feel like it's, I think it becomes so hard because we want to increase options for people, but with an option that increases your risk of HIV acquisition by at least a quarter is a lot, right? Like, why would we consider that still safe and accessible out in the world? So I feel like, especially if it's been over this many long periods of time, and also that even with the new method of injection, that it's still having that increased risk of HIV acquisition, that it just feels problematic to recommend at all. Like, what are the benefits in Depo that people aren't getting in any other method? Like, that's what I'm curious about. And I think that that's where, you know, it needs to be considered. I do feel like sometimes folks think a shot is a little bit convenient in regards to not having to think about something for 3 months, right? But I think the benefits and it's also subjective. So I think, like, I actually would like to, I've never heard from somebody that said that they like the shot, which is also surprising. Like, everybody who I've known who has used Depo has not said that they really liked it. So I think that that's also, there should be an acceptability study of like what people like about the Depo shot, to make it even worth the risk of HIV acquisition, which in my mind, I don't, you know, like, that to me is not a risk that I would want to take. But it also proves the fact that, like, people are still focusing on pregnancy prevention, and STI prevention is not part of the conversation. I think that's also what's being proven, is that, first of all, best practice is dual method use, right? So using something to prevent STIs, and also using something to prevent pregnancy if that's your goal, right? So you should be counseling on condoms as well as any other method, right? And so it's very clear that when you prioritize pregnancy prevention, you deprioritize STI prevention, and that it comes even from Anne's, that quote that Anne shared about how it's been deemed for women and girls in Africa that getting pregnant is worse than getting HIV, right? And so, like, it's just very clear. So I feel like, with the fact that we have new methods coming out, that we have other methods that don't increase these risks, that there's no reason to keep Depo as an option there. Especially if people are making so much effort to, like, hide the fact that it does increase HIV acquisition. My fear is, like, well, why aren't you uplifting that at all, right? Why does this statistically significant have to be over 50% before you acknowledge that this is a thing? And so that makes me want to get into the motives of why people are even keeping it on the market, right? And so that makes it very clear it's about profit, and it's also easily distributable. And so that's the concern.
Yeah, and I have one thing that thank you, made me realize is, you know, some groups in the US, and I brought this up as I was closing, that I really respect. These are groups that I'll just name: the National Women's Health Network and Sister Love, who I have a lot of respect for both of those groups, did consult around the trials, and really wanted them to happen. And they were doing that in solidarity with users who wanted it to happen. So this is a very, very tricky, important conversation that I think should be much louder and much broader, because this is, to me, is very troubling, right? That there can be such disagreement within what could be considered reproductive justice spaces, that we should really be having this out as a conversation of people who disagree, and not just people who either take a stance against or for and aren't talking to each other, because it further muddies what Depo means, right? To have endorsement by some groups and other groups that are taking it on. So I think that's sort of trying to answer your question, is that these trials happened with the endorsement of powerful and important groups, but I do want us to heartily disagree. I hope to change people's minds and take on these questions that we're raising about power, and power in whose hands.
Thank you so much.
I did want to share, somebody put in the chat box, Hannah, that one potential benefit of the Depo shot is that it is discreet. And so that is, definitely a priority for a lot of folks, like wanting to use a discrete method that either people in their home don't know about, partners don't know about, and other people who could potentially interfere, interact, or have a reaction to it. So I definitely understand that the shot can be discrete for some folks. And I also want to uplift the fact that there are other methods that are also discrete, right? And so I think that's important to keep having this conversation. And so somebody also shared the implant was discrete for, Lonnie shared the implant was discrete for me once the initial swelling went down, speaking from when I had Nexplanon before rushing to remove it because of the side effects. So don't want to assume you aren't also speaking from experience. Yeah, so I appreciate that. And so that is also a reality, right, of there are folks who we can't make an assumption of what method works best for folks. So I do think that they're being able to have the full information though, right, and being able to decide, like, would discrete be the important if you also were at risk for HIV acquisition and you wanted to know if you were increasing your risk with this new method or not. Yeah, so I think it's hard. Like, I don't necessarily want to like have less methods available. I just want us to have all the full information about that. Because technically there are 255 FDA approved methods of contraception out there, not just types, but like even brand names of pills and stuff. And so if we have so many options, why are we only talking about a handful of them? And why aren't we talking about the full picture of what they are, right? Which is all the goods and the bads, right? And not viewing it as like we're scaring people away from it. No, this is what informed consent means, is that you aren't getting to navigate the risks that you want to, and not being pushed into taking risks that you weren't ready for.
I was going to add, but I think because it's 12:12 and I'm mindful of the time, that I just wanted to thank Aisha, and I wanted to thank you all for being here and invite you to contact me for any reason. I'd love to hear more about your questions or what you know, if you've been seeing the Sayana press in your communities, all of the things that, yes, exactly, that you might want to share. I'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yes, I just want to echo, thank you so much, Anne. It was so great to present with you. And I learned so much more every time I talk to you. And so it's going to leave this on the screen for a little bit so folks get a moment to get our emails if you have any questions. But we would love to keep talking about this with anybody who's interested. And so glad that you all found it informative. Again, also in the chat, we shared the resources that we wanted to have with our presentation, and the Zoom host is adding it to our session information for folks too. But just wanted to say thank you all and hope you have a good rest of your conference. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.